On the afternoon of July 18th, 1997, a man was driving down a quiet, winding road in Douglas County, Wisconsin. This was a very rural area, surrounded on both sides by thick, dense trees. There were no other cars on the road that day, and so this driver was moving at a pretty fast pace, enjoying the quiet scenery. As he rounded a sharp bend in the road, something caught his eye out of the passenger side window. It was lying in the tall grass right on the shoulder of the road. At first, he could not really tell what it was because he was driving too fast, but he could tell that it was a very large, bright object and it looked completely out of place in this natural environment. He continued driving down the road for a bit, but he just could not stop thinking about what he had seen. Something about that shape in the grass felt strange, and he felt this growing sense of curiosity. So, he slowed his car down, pulled over onto the gravel shoulder, and parked. He turned off the engine, stepped out of the car, and began walking back along the edge of the road in the direction he had just come from. The only sounds around him were the rustling of the leaves in the wind and the crunch of gravel beneath his shoes. As he got closer to the spot where he thought the object was, he began scanning the tall grass, and then he saw it again. It was partially obscured by the weeds and the brush, making it difficult to identify from a distance. But as he took a few more steps forward, getting within 20 or 30 feet of it, he finally got a clear, unobstructed view, and he completely froze in his tracks. The object in the grass was actually a man. But what was truly bizarre was how this man was dressed. He was wearing a pristine, bright white suit, a matching white belt, and white shoes. He was lying on his back, completely motionless. For a brief second, the driver thought that maybe this guy was just taking a nap or had passed out in the grass. But then, as he took one more step closer, he saw a massive, gaping hole in the center of the man's chest. There was blood everywhere, and it was very obvious that this man was dead. Terrified, the driver turned around, ran back to his car as fast as he could, got inside, and sped down the road to find the nearest house. When he finally found one, he knocked on the door, told the homeowner what he had found, and immediately called 911. The next morning, a Douglas County detective named Stephen Long was sitting at his desk, looking at the crime scene photos of the dead man in white. This murder investigation was less than 24 hours old, but already it was proving to be one of the strangest cases Detective Long had ever been assigned to. The victim had been identified almost immediately because he was carrying his wallet in his pocket. Inside the wallet was his driver's license, which identified him as 45-year-old Mark Foster. But knowing the man's identity actually made the case much more confusing, not less. It turned out that Mark Foster was a highly successful millionaire who lived 3 hours away in Minneapolis, Minnesota. He had no obvious family ties, no business connections, and no reason to ever be in Douglas County, Wisconsin. And so, Detective Long was sitting there scratching his head, wondering what on earth this wealthy man from the big city was doing dressed head to toe in a white suit, lying dead on the side of a random, isolated county road in rural Wisconsin. But the mystery was about to get even deeper. Shortly after the medical examiner conducted the autopsy on Mark, he called Detective Long with a bizarre discovery. The medical examiner had found a small folded-up piece of paper tucked deep inside one of Mark's white shoes. Detective Long immediately went to inspect the note, and when he unfolded it, he saw a short handwritten message. The note said, "Jack Frazier isn't here, but it's Jimmy Bailey or a look-alike. I hope I'm okay." Nobody, including Detective Long, had any idea what this message meant. It was incredibly cryptic. But when investigators ran the names Jack Frazier and Jimmy Bailey through their database, they discovered that both of these men actually existed, and they both lived in Minnesota, in the very same area where Mark Foster lived. Naturally, Detective Long began to suspect that these two men had to be connected to Mark's murder in some way. Perhaps they were involved in a business dispute, or maybe they had followed him out to Wisconsin to kill him. It was the only real lead they had, so Detective Long packed his bags, got in his car, and made the 3-hour drive to Minneapolis to find some answers. A few hours later, Detective Long parked his car outside the Minneapolis police station and walked inside. Waiting for him was a local detective who had already made contact with Mark's family. The two detectives went into a quiet interview room where Mark's wife was waiting for them. Right away, Detective Long noticed two things about her. First, she was very pregnant. Second, she appeared to be at least 15 or 20 years younger than Mark. But despite the tragic news of her husband's sudden death, she seemed incredibly composed, almost resigned to the situation. The detective sat down and began asking her about Mark's life, his business dealings, and his daily routine. But the breakthrough came when they brought up the note found in Mark's shoe. The moment Detective Long read the names Jack Frazier and Jimmy Bailey out loud, the wife's composure completely shattered. She immediately broke down into tears, sobbing uncontrollably. Once she managed to calm herself down enough to speak, she revealed a shocking connection. She told the detectives that before she married Mark, she had been in romantic relationships with both Jack Frazier and Jimmy Bailey. After she broke up with them and married Mark, both men became consumed with jealousy and anger. She explained that Jack and Jimmy had a deep, bitter hatred for Mark because they felt he had stolen her away from them. She had always felt that they had it out for her husband, and she feared they might try to hurt him one day. After the interview ended, Detective Long began to think that this case, which had initially seemed so complex and bizarre, might actually be quite simple. It looked like a classic story of romantic jealousy and revenge. Perhaps Jimmy and Jack had lured Mark out to Wisconsin or followed him there to exact their revenge, and Mark, sensing danger, had written the note and hidden it in his shoe just in case something happened to him. It seemed to make perfect sense. However, over the next few days, as investigators began digging into this theory, it completely fell apart. Detective Long tracked down both Jack Frazier and Jimmy Bailey, and when he checked their timelines, he discovered that both men had airtight, undeniable alibis for the day Mark was murdered. There was absolutely no physical or circumstantial way either of them could have been in Wisconsin. They were completely ruled out as suspects. Detective Long was incredibly frustrated. He felt like he had been so close to solving the mystery, and now he was right back at square one. But he refused to give up. He decided that if he wanted to understand why Mark was murdered, he needed to understand who Mark really was. Up to this point, he had only spoken to family members and associates in formal settings, but he had not actually been inside Mark's home. So, he obtained a search warrant for Mark Foster's house. On July 29th, roughly a week after the murder, Detective Long and his partner pulled up to a large, beautiful two-story home in a quiet, wealthy suburban neighborhood of Minneapolis. From the outside, the house looked totally normal, just like any other upscale family home on the block. But once the detectives stepped inside, they realized that the interior was anything but ordinary. Mark's wife opened the door and let the detectives in. As they walked through the foyer, Detective Long's jaw nearly dropped. Hanging all over the walls of the first floor were massive, highly graphic paintings and photographs of naked people in various explicit poses. On the coffee tables and side tables in the living room were stacks of explicit adult magazines and books, left out in the open as if they were everyday decorations. What made it even stranger was that Mark's wife acted completely oblivious to it all. She casually walked them through the house as if they were touring a perfectly normal suburban home. The two detectives exchanged a look of disbelief. Sensing that they needed to conduct their search without her presence, Detective Long politely asked the wife if she would mind sitting on the living room couch while they looked around. She agreed and sat down, and the detectives immediately went upstairs to see what else they could find. On the second floor, they located the master bedroom suite. When they walked inside, they found a room that looked like a specialized dungeon. There was heavy bondage gear attached to the bedposts, including leather straps, whips, chains, and handcuffs, along with even more explicit materials scattered around. But given what they had seen on the first floor, they were not entirely shocked by this. They continued searching the other rooms on the second floor, finding similar adult materials in almost every corner. Then, as they walked back out into the second floor hallway, they noticed a pull-down rope hanging from the ceiling. It was attached to the wooden door that led up into the attic. The detectives walked over, pulled the rope, and watched as the wooden stairs folded down. They climbed up into the darkness, completely unprepared for what they were about to discover. The attic was not being used for storage. It had been completely transformed into a highly functional, deeply unsettling room that resembled a dark occult temple. Every single wall in the attic was painted a solid, pitch-black color. Burned-out candles were placed on various tables and ledges all around the room, and the floor was littered with tarot cards and strange symbols. At the far end of the attic, standing against the back wall, was a large, elaborate altar that overlooked the entire space. The detectives walked slowly across the dark room toward the altar, and when they got close enough, they stopped and stared in absolute shock. Resting on the altar, surrounded by more candles and a voodoo doll, were two business cards. When Detective Long looked closely at them, he realized they were his own business card and his partner's business card. The detectives immediately ran downstairs, visibly shaken, and confronted Mark's wife about the attic. They demanded to know what was going on up there, why the room was decorated like an occult temple, and most importantly, why their personal business cards were sitting on the altar. But the moment the detectives mentioned the attic, the wife's cooperative demeanor vanished. She went completely silent, refused to look them in the eye, and would not answer a single question about the room upstairs. Realizing they were getting nowhere, the detectives called for backup, and a full team of forensic investigators arrived to conduct a thorough search of the property. They cataloged everything, but other than finding more occult items and adult materials, they found nothing that directly explained what had happened to Mark on that lonely road in Wisconsin. They also still had no idea how their business cards had ended up on that altar. Detective Long warned the wife not to leave the city, as they would be keeping a very close eye on her. Now, Detective Long was left wondering if Mark had been involved in some kind of bizarre cult, and if his murder was perhaps a ritualistic sacrifice or the result of some internal cult dispute. He also had to consider if he and his partner were now in danger, given that their cards had been placed on the altar. They decided they needed to consult with someone who understood the occult. It just so happened that there was a specialized occult bookstore located very close to Mark's house. The detectives decided to pay a visit to the shop, hoping the owner could give them some insight into the symbols they had seen in the attic. As soon as they walked into the bookstore and explained who they were, their investigation took a massive leap forward. The owner of the bookstore was indeed an expert in the occult, but more importantly, he personally knew Mark Foster. He told the detectives that Mark was a regular customer who spent thousands of dollars in his shop buying books on dark rituals, magic, and ceremonies. Furthermore, the owner knew many of Mark's close friends and associates. By the time the detectives left the bookstore, they had a list of names of young people in their 20s who frequently associated with Mark and visited his home. The detectives tracked down these young associates and began bringing them in for questioning. To the detectives' surprise, these young people did not try to hide anything. They were incredibly open about their relationship with Mark. They explained that they were members of a highly secretive religious group, and they openly referred to Mark as their spiritual leader. They described him as a man with incredible charisma and power. But as the detectives continued to press them for details about the group's hierarchy and practices, a new name kept coming up: Greg Freiner. The group members described Greg as Mark's most loyal and trusted follower. They told the detectives that if they wanted to know the deepest secrets of the group, they needed to talk to Greg. It took the detectives a few days to track Greg down, but they eventually located him and brought him into the interrogation room. Greg was a young man, but he seemed completely calm and unfazed by the police environment. And when the detectives began asking him about Mark's final days, Greg did not make excuses or try to deny his involvement. Instead, he sat back and told the detectives a story so bizarre that they could hardly believe what they were hearing. According to Greg, on the morning of July 18, 1997, he drove to Mark Foster's home to pick him up. When Mark came out of the house, he was dressed completely in a pristine white suit, white belt, and white shoes. This was the attire Mark wore only for the group's most sacred and important ceremonies. Mark got into the back seat of Greg's car, and they began driving northeast toward Wisconsin. Greg said they drove for over 3 hours in absolute, unbroken silence. Mark just stared out the window, looking deeply at peace. At some point during the drive, Mark pulled a small piece of paper from his pocket, wrote a short note on it, smiled to himself, and then folded it up and slipped it inside his white shoe. Eventually, Greg pulled the car over onto the shoulder of an isolated, quiet road in Douglas County, Wisconsin. Both men got out of the car. They walked to the back of the vehicle, and Greg opened the trunk, revealing a high-powered rifle. Greg picked up the rifle, and Mark casually walked over to the grassy shoulder of the road, turning to face Greg. Greg walked over and stood just a few feet away from his leader. Mark looked Greg in the eyes, composed himself, and then gave a gentle nod of his head. This was the signal. Greg raised the rifle, pointed it directly at Mark's chest, and pulled the trigger. Mark collapsed into the tall grass, moaning in pain for several minutes while Greg stood over him, watching him die. Once Mark went completely silent, Greg walked back to his car, drove down the road, and threw the rifle into a nearby river. He then drove back to Minneapolis, feeling a sense of profound peace and accomplishment. The detectives were stunned. They asked Greg why on earth he would do this, and why Mark would want to be shot on the side of a road. Greg explained that in their religious group, they did not believe death was the end. Mark had taught his followers that death was simply a transition, a crossing over to a higher spiritual plane. Mark believed that if he was killed in a specific, ritualistic way by his most loyal disciple, his soul, his consciousness, and all of his spiritual power would instantly transfer directly into Greg. By doing this, Mark believed he would achieve true immortality, living on through Greg and guiding the group forever. The entire event had been meticulously planned by Mark himself. The mysterious note found in Mark's shoe had been written by Mark as a clever way to protect Greg from the police. Mark knew that the authorities would investigate his death as a homicide, so he wrote down the names of his wife's ex-lovers, Jack and Jimmy, knowing that the police would immediately suspect them of a crime of passion, thereby drawing all the attention away from Greg and the cult. As for the graphic art, the explicit magazines, and the bondage gear found in the house, it turned out that Mark used these materials as part of his spiritual practices. He taught his followers that engaging in elaborate sexual rituals with him was a way to channel spiritual energy and increase his personal power. The detectives' business cards on the altar had been placed there by other cult members after Mark's death. They believed that by placing the cards on the occult altar and performing rituals over them, they could spiritually block the police from discovering the truth. In the end, Greg Freiner was arrested and charged with his role in Mark Foster's death. Even though it was technically an assisted suicide planned entirely by the victim, the law viewed Greg as the triggerman in a homicide. He was ultimately convicted and sentenced to 10 years in prison. Mark's wife, although clearly aware of the cult's activities, was never found to have any direct involvement in the planning or execution of the murder, and she was never charged. The quiet, wealthy neighborhood of Minneapolis was left shocked by the realization of what had been happening inside that ordinary-looking suburban home, and the case of the millionaire in white remains one of the most bizarre chapters in Wisconsin history. Now, we are going to move on to our second story, which takes us to the deep, isolated woods of northern Michigan. On the night of October 17, 2019, a 47-year-old woman named Ada Quintal walked out of her family's historic cabin to take her dog for a quick walk and have a smoke. It was about 1:30 in the morning, and the air was crisp and cold. The cabin was located in a very remote area, surrounded on all sides by dense forests, marshes, and swamps, with the nearest neighbor living more than half a mile away. For most people, being completely alone in such an isolated place in the dead of night would be terrifying. But for Ada, this solitude was exactly what she needed. Just a few months earlier, Ada had been living her normal life in the densely populated suburbs of Detroit, where she worked as an engineer. One afternoon, while she was out in the city in broad daylight, a man she had never seen before suddenly ran up to her and launched a brutal, unprovoked attack. He beat her severely, breaking her nose and giving her a serious concussion before running off into the crowd. The man was never caught, and the police could find absolutely no motive for the attack. He had not tried to rob her or steal anything. It was just a random act of violence. This ordeal had a devastating effect on Ada's mental and physical health. She became deeply paranoid, depressed, and anxious, constantly feeling like someone was watching her or waiting to attack her again. To make matters worse, she was laid off from her engineering job shortly after. When her uncle called her and offered to pay her to stay at the family's cabin to clean it up and winterize it, Ada jumped at the opportunity. The cabin had been in her family for 75 years, and it was filled with happy childhood memories. She saw this as a chance to escape the stressful environment of the city, find some peace of mind, and recover from her trauma. For the past week, Ada and her boyfriend had been staying at the cabin together doing repairs. But 2 days prior, her boyfriend had to return to Detroit to manage another property they were renovating, leaving Ada completely alone with her dog. Ada was perfectly fine with this, as she felt much safer out in the quiet wilderness than she ever did in the crowded city. On this particular night, however, Ada was having a terrible time trying to sleep. She had taken some medication to help her relax, but she still felt incredibly wired and anxious. Hoping that some fresh air would calm her nerves, she decided to take her dog out for a walk along the dark, winding dirt road surrounding the cabin. There were no streetlights out here, and the darkness was absolute. But Ada knew these roads like the back of her hand. For protection, she slipped a loaded 9mm pistol into her jacket pocket. As they walked down the pitch-black road, Ada's dog suddenly stopped. His ears perked up, his back stiffened, and he let out a low, menacing growl, staring intently into the dark woods ahead. Ada felt her heart rate spike. She raised her flashlight and shined the beam in the direction the dog was looking. The bright cone of light cut through the darkness and immediately illuminated two glowing amber eyes staring directly back at her. Ada realized she was looking at a massive mountain lion. Doing her best not to panic, she slowly reached into her pocket and gripped her pistol. But before she could pull it out, the mountain lion blinked, turned, and vanished silently into the thick brush. Breathing a massive sigh of relief, Ada tightly gripped her dog's leash, turned around, and hurried back to the safety of the cabin. She went inside, locked the door behind her, and let her dog off his leash. She was still trembling from the adrenaline rush, so she grabbed her phone and sent a quick text to her boyfriend, telling him about the close encounter with the mountain lion. But as she stood in the kitchen trying to calm down, she suddenly heard a faint sound coming from the living room window. It sounded like twigs snapping and dry leaves rustling, as if someone was walking right past the side of the cabin. The layout of the cabin was quite open. The kitchen area led directly into the living room, which had several large windows looking out into the yard. Because all the lights were on inside the cabin, the glass of the windows acted like mirrors, making it impossible to see into the darkness outside unless you pressed your face directly against the glass. Nervous, Ada crept into the living room, walked up to the window, and pressed her face against the cold pane, peering out into the night. She saw nothing but blackness. She tried to convince herself that it was just the mountain lion lurking around, or perhaps just a deer, but deep down, she felt a cold dread creeping in. She took off her jacket, sat on the couch, turned on the TV, and tried to distract herself. About 20 minutes later, Ada heard a much louder, much more distinct sound coming from the exact same window. She looked up, and even with the glare from the indoor lights, she could clearly see a dark shape moving right outside. It looked unmistakably like a man creeping around her property. Terrified, Ada grabbed her gun from the table, lunged behind the couch, and crouched down in the darkness. She yelled out as loudly as she could, warning the intruder that she was armed and would shoot if they tried to come inside. But there was no response, only the sound of the wind howling through the trees. As she lay behind the couch, straining her ears, she suddenly heard the heavy, unmistakable sound of footsteps walking onto her wooden front porch. Ada gasped, clutching her gun with shaking hands. She pulled out her phone and began dialing 911, but then she paused. She began to doubt herself. Ever since the attack in Detroit, she had been incredibly paranoid. Was she just imagining things? Was it just an animal on the porch? She was terrified of making a fool of herself by calling the police out to the middle of nowhere for a false alarm. So instead of calling 911, she decided to call her boyfriend. Her boyfriend did not answer, which was not surprising given that it was now nearly 2:30 in the morning. Desperate for someone to talk to, she called one of her close friends. To her relief, the friend answered the phone. Ada, speaking in a frantic whisper, began pouring out everything that had happened, from the mountain lion to the noises outside and the footsteps on the porch. She was crying, terrified, but still questioning her own sanity. Her friend did not hesitate and told Ada that she was going to call the local police on her behalf, asking for Ada's address. Ada gave her the address but begged her friend not to call the police just yet. She wanted to do one quick check of the windows to make sure there really was someone there before sending the authorities. Her friend reluctantly agreed to stay on the line while Ada checked. With her phone in one hand and her pistol in the other, Ada crept silently through the kitchen. She stayed low, keeping below the window line until she reached the kitchen sink. She slowly raised her head and peeked through the small window that looked directly out onto the front porch. The porch was completely empty. There was no one there. Ada let out a relieved breath, realizing she had likely just let her imagination run wild. She stood up fully, preparing to tell her friend on the phone that everything was fine and not to call the police. But as she turned around to walk back to the living room, she froze in absolute horror. Standing right outside the large living room window were the distinct silhouettes of two men staring directly into the cabin at her. Acting on pure survival instinct, Ada raised her pistol and pointed it at the window. To her terror, the two men outside instantly raised handguns of their own, pointing them directly at her. Ada squeezed the trigger, firing multiple rounds through the glass. The men outside began firing back, and the sound of shattering glass and gunshots filled the cabin. Ada collapsed to the floor, screaming into her phone to her friend, "There are two men, they are shooting at me, I think I shot one of them." Her friend was screaming in panic on the other end of the line, saying she was calling the police, and then the call suddenly disconnected. The gunfire abruptly stopped, leaving the cabin in a deafening, dusty silence. Ada lay huddled behind the kitchen island, clutching her empty gun, terrified that the surviving intruder was going to walk through the door and finish her off. Then she heard a heavy, thumping sound coming from directly above her on the second floor of the cabin. One of the intruders had somehow made it inside and was upstairs. Ada knew she had to get out, but a wave of anger and resolve washed over her. She was tired of running, tired of being a victim. She decided to stand her ground. She reloaded her gun, crept to the stairs, and began to climb up into the dark second floor. 30 minutes later, several police cars raced up the long dirt driveway to the cabin, their sirens wailing. Ada's friend had called 911 and reported that Ada was actively engaged in a shootout with two armed men. The deputies arrived with their weapons drawn, expecting a violent confrontation. They secured the perimeter, but the yard was completely silent. When they entered the cabin, they found a scene of total chaos. There were bullet holes in the walls, the kitchen island was torn up, and the living room windows were shattered. But there was no sign of Ada, and no sign of any intruders. The only living thing inside was Ada's dog, who was hiding under a bed, terrified but uninjured. A massive search of the property was immediately launched. During the search, investigators made a series of baffling discoveries. On the metal roof of the cabin, they found Ada's shoes and her cell phone left placed neatly on the metal panels. On the ground, directly below the roof, they found her 9mm pistol. But there was no blood, no signs of a struggle, and no footprints leading away from the house other than Ada's own tracks. They checked every local hospital to see if anyone had checked in with a gunshot wound, but no one had. For weeks, the police searched the dense woods, marshes, and swamps surrounding the cabin using tracking dogs, helicopters, and search teams, but they found absolutely nothing. They began to suspect Ada's boyfriend, but he had a perfect alibi, having been in Detroit with Ada's adult son at the exact time of the incident. There was no evidence of any foul play on his part, and no motive. They also investigated the theory that her Detroit attacker had tracked her down, but that seemed highly improbable. As the weeks turned into months, the case went completely cold, and the small community was left whispering about bizarre theories, ranging from a planned disappearance to alien abductions. Finally, on December 21st, 2019, nearly 2 months after Ada vanished, her family made a desperate decision. They decided to drain a large, deep pond located about 300 yards from the cabin, a pond that had already been searched by police divers. As the water level dropped, they made a tragic discovery. Ada's body was lying at the bottom of the pond, covered in just a foot of muddy water. Everyone assumed that the autopsy would reveal she had been shot by the intruders, but when the medical examiner performed the examination, they found absolutely no gunshot wounds, no stab wounds, and no physical injuries at all. There were no bruises or defensive wounds to suggest she had been in a fight. In fact, she had not even drowned. The cause of death was determined to be hypothermia, combined with a highly toxic mixture of drugs in her system. It turned out that Ada had been struggling far more than anyone realized. To cope with the extreme trauma of her Detroit attack, she had turned to heavy drug use. On the night she died, she had taken Valium to sleep, but when that did not work, she had smoked methamphetamine. Methamphetamine is a powerful stimulant that can induce extreme, terrifying paranoia and vivid hallucinations, especially in someone already suffering from severe post-traumatic stress disorder. The entire shootout had been a tragic illusion. The two men Ada saw in the window were actually her own reflection in the glass. Because of her drug-induced state, she believed her reflection was an armed intruder, and when she raised her gun, her reflection did the same. When she shot at the window, she was shooting at herself. The sounds she heard upstairs were likely just the natural settling noises of the old cabin, amplified by her heightened state of fear. In her panic, she had climbed out of a second-story window onto the roof to hide. She left her shoes and phone there, dropped her gun, and leapt to the ground. She then ran blindly into the freezing woods, completely lost in a hallucinatory terror, until she collapsed into the shallow pond and succumbed to the freezing temperatures. The monsters Ada was fighting that night were not real. They were the tragic projections of her own traumatized mind. Now, we are going to travel back in time to the winter of 1980, to a dark highway in rural Texas, where three people would encounter something that would change their lives and their health forever. Around 9 o'clock on the night of December 29, 1980, a 57-year-old woman named Vicki Landrum was riding in the passenger seat of her friend Betty Cash's old Oldsmobile. Sitting between them in the front seat was Vicki's 7-year-old grandson, Colby, whom she was raising. The three of them had just finished having a nice dinner at a local highway truck stop and were now making the long drive back to their homes in Huffman, Texas, a small, quiet town located about 30 miles northeast of Houston. As they drove down the dark, two-lane highway which was surrounded on both sides by dense pine forests, the night air was freezing. The contrast between the cold outside and the warmth inside the car began to cause the windshield to fog up, obscuring Betty's view of the road. Vicki reached over and turned on the defroster to clear the glass. As the condensation began to fade away, Vicki looked out through the windshield and noticed a very bright, intense light hovering high in the sky, directly ahead of them, just above the tree line. At first, Vicki did not think much of it. They were not too far from the Houston Intercontinental Airport, so she assumed it was just a commercial airplane preparing to land. But as Betty continued to drive down the winding highway, Vicki realized that this light was not moving like an airplane. It was not descending, and it was not flying across the sky. Instead, it appeared to be hovering completely still, and as they got closer, the light seemed to be getting larger and more intense. At the same time, Vicki began to notice a physical change inside the car. The temperature inside the vehicle began to rise rapidly, far beyond what the car's heater was capable of producing. Within minutes, the air became incredibly hot, stuffy, and dry. Vicki and Betty began to sweat profusely, panting for air as if they were sitting inside an oven. Before they could fully comprehend what was happening, the bright light suddenly moved out from behind the trees and descended directly into the middle of the highway, blocking their path. Vicki screamed at Betty to stop the car. Betty slammed on the brakes, and the Oldsmobile came to a screeching halt about 100 feet away from the object. There, hovering just a few feet above the asphalt, was a massive, terrifying aircraft unlike anything any of them had ever seen in their lives. The craft was diamond-shaped, roughly the size of a large school bus, and it appeared to be constructed of a dark, metallic material that was glowing red-hot from the sheer amount of energy it was emitting. The object was making a deep, deafening roaring sound similar to a massive jet engine running at full power. Every few seconds, a huge blast of bright blue and orange fire would shoot downward from the bottom of the craft, striking the road and sending waves of intense heat washing over the car. Colby immediately began to cry hysterically, terrified by the loud noise and the blinding light. Betty tried to put the car in reverse to turn around and escape, but the highway was too narrow, and the dense pine trees on either side made it impossible to turn the heavy car around without getting stuck. They were completely trapped. The heat inside the car was becoming unbearable. The dashboard was hot to the touch, and the metal on the car's exterior was beginning to bake. As the minutes passed and the craft remained suspended over the road, Betty and Vicki's fear began to turn into a strange, intense curiosity. They could not believe what they were looking at. Betty decided she had to get out of the car to get a better look. She opened the driver's side door and stepped out into the blast of hot air. Seeing her friend go, Vicki told Colby to stay down on the floorboards, and she opened her door and stepped out as well. Vicki was a deeply religious woman, and as she stood on the highway staring at this glowing, fire-spitting diamond in the sky, she was suddenly reminded of a biblical prophecy she had read. She recalled passages about the second coming of Christ, describing his return in a pillar of fire. In her mind, she began to wonder if she was witnessing a holy, miraculous event. She felt a sense of awe and began to walk toward the craft. But her spiritual moment was instantly shattered by the sound of Colby screaming from inside the car. He was terrified, crying out for his grandmother. Vicki turned around, ran back to the car, and climbed inside to comfort him. She found Colby scrunched up on the floor under the dashboard, shaking with fear. Vicky wrapped her arms around him, holding him tight, and began to pray out loud to calm him down. Meanwhile, Betty remained standing outside next to the open car door, completely mesmerized by the glowing object, seemingly unable to tear her eyes away despite the intense heat and deafening roar. They stayed like this for about 10 minutes until Vicky heard the roaring sound of the craft change in pitch, becoming significantly louder and higher. She looked up through the windshield and saw that the diamond-shaped craft was beginning to rise. As it ascended, a massive column of fire erupted from its base, illuminating the entire forest. Betty finally climbed back into the driver's seat, shutting out the intense heat. As the craft reached a higher altitude, Vicky and Betty witnessed something even more surprising. Out from the darkness, a large group of military-style helicopters appeared, surrounding the diamond-shaped craft. Vicky counted at least 23 twin-rotor CH-47 Chinook helicopters, which were commonly used by the United States military. The helicopters formed an escort around the glowing craft, and the entire fleet flew off into the night sky, disappearing over the horizon. Once the sky was empty and the road was clear, the highway returned to its natural, quiet state. Betty, Vicky, and Colby sat in the car in complete silence, stunned by what they had just witnessed. The presence of the military helicopters made it clear to Vicky that this was not a religious miracle, but rather some kind of highly classified government aircraft or military technology. Betty put the car in gear, drove forward, passing right over the spot where the craft had hovered, and drove Vicky and Colby home. They said their goodnights, both women eager to just put the terrifying experience behind them and go to sleep. But within hours of getting into bed, the nightmare truly began. Colby woke up crying, complaining of severe stomach pain and nausea, and soon began vomiting. Shortly after, Vicky began to experience the same severe nausea and diarrhea. They spent the entire night in the bathroom, violently ill. Vicky assumed they must have gotten food poisoning from the truck stop, but things were about to get much worse. When Vicky looked in the bathroom mirror the next morning, she let out a scream. Her face, neck, and arms were bright red and covered in painful weeping blisters, looking as though she had been exposed to a horrific sunburn. She checked on Colby and found that he also had red, blistered skin, though his symptoms were not quite as severe as hers, likely because he had spent the majority of the encounter hiding on the floorboards of the car under the dashboard, shielded from the direct light of the craft. Vicky tried to call Betty to check on her, but the phone just rang and rang with no answer. Vicky was too weak and sick to drive over to Betty's house, so she and Colby stayed in bed, hoping their symptoms would improve. Over the next few days, Vicky's skin began to peel off in large patches, and her eyes became swollen and highly sensitive to light. She finally managed to get in touch with Betty's family, who told her that Betty was in a catastrophic state. 5 days after the incident, Vicky was finally well enough to visit Betty. When she walked into Betty's bedroom, she was horrified by what she saw. Betty was lying in bed, barely conscious, covered in deep, bloody blisters. Large clumps of her hair had fallen out onto her pillow, and she was in excruciating pain. Vicky immediately helped Betty into her car and rushed her to the nearest hospital. The doctors who treated Betty were completely baffled. They had never seen anything like it. Her skin was literally sloughing off her body, and her white blood cell count was dangerously low. One of the specialists noted that her symptoms were identical to those of someone who had been exposed to a massive dose of ionizing radiation, like a victim of a nuclear accident. When Vicky tried to explain about the glowing, fire-spitting craft on the highway, the doctors dismissed her story, believing the women were simply suffering from a rare medical condition or were fabricating the story. But Vicky knew the truth. She was determined to find out what the government had put over that highway. She began writing letters to local politicians and military officials, demanding answers. In early 1981, her story reached John Schessler, a respected aerospace engineer who worked for NASA and was also a lead investigator for the Mutual UFO Network. John was a practical man of science who usually spent his time debunking UFO sightings, but when he met Vicky and Betty and saw the medical records of their horrific injuries, he knew this was a genuine mystery. John accompanied Vicky back to the stretch of highway where the incident had occurred. When they arrived, John did not even need Vicky to point out the spot. There, in the middle of the asphalt, was a perfect, distinct dark circle where the road surface had literally melted from extreme heat and then cooled back down, leaving a permanent scar on the highway. John took soil and plant samples from the area and began interviewing local residents. To his amazement, John found several other witnesses. A local police officer and his wife, who had been driving miles away on the same night, reported seeing a bright, fiery object escorted by military helicopters in the exact direction of the highway. Several campers in a nearby state park reported the same thing. John had undeniable proof that a massive, heat-emitting craft had been in the area, escorted by the United States military. John officially contacted the U.S. Army, Navy, and Air Force, presenting his evidence and asking for information on the aircraft. But every single branch of the military gave him the exact same answer. They had absolutely no operations in that area on December 29, 1980, and they did not own or operate any diamond-shaped aircraft. They claimed the helicopters must have been a visual mistake. Then, a few weeks later, John received a call from a local resident who lived near the highway. The resident told him that a fleet of unmarked black government vehicles and heavy road construction equipment had suddenly arrived at the exact spot on the highway where the melted circle was. The workers had cut out that specific section of the road, loaded the asphalt into dump trucks, and completely repaved the stretch of highway with fresh black asphalt, effectively destroying the physical evidence of the scorch mark. The Cash Landrum incident became one of the most famous and highly scrutinized UFO cases in history. Vicky, Betty, and Colby eventually filed a multi-million-dollar lawsuit against the United States government, claiming that the military was testing a highly dangerous radioactive experimental aircraft over a public highway, resulting in their severe injuries. But because the government officially denied the existence of the craft, and the plaintiffs could not prove which branch of the military was responsible, the lawsuit was ultimately dismissed by a federal judge. Betty Cash never fully recovered from her injuries. She spent the rest of her life in and out of hospitals, suffering from chronic illness, and eventually died of cancer in 1998. Vicky Landrum also suffered from chronic health issues, including severe vision loss and skin damage, and passed away from cancer years later. Colby, who survived with fewer physical scars, was left to carry the psychological burden of that terrifying night, forever wondering what secret government machine had descended from the sky to destroy his family's health. Now, for our final story, we are going to travel back over 250 years into the past to a remote, impoverished province in southern France, where a young boy's bravery would make him a national legend. On the cold morning of January 12, 1765, a 12-year-old boy named Jacques Portufy sat up in his bed, gasping for air. He was sweating, his heart pounding against his ribs. He had just woken up from a terrifying nightmare where he was being chased through the dark woods by a monstrous, unseen beast that eventually caught him right as he woke up. Jacques wiped the tears from his eyes, hoping his brothers and sisters had not seen him crying. They all lived in a tiny one-room stone cottage in the province of Jebouan, France. Jacques was the oldest of 8 children, and they all slept on simple straw mattresses on the floor. In this brutal, impoverished region of France, weakness was not tolerated. Jacques had a reputation in his village for being a coward, a wet chicken, as the other children called him. Just a few weeks earlier, he had been beaten in a fight by a much younger boy, and he had cried in front of the entire village. Even his own siblings joined in on the teasing, making him feel deeply ashamed. Jacques did not want to be a tough physical farm boy. He was a gentle, quiet child who loved to read and study. His dream was to become a priest, like his uncle who lived in a distant town. Whenever Jacques got the chance to visit his uncle, he would spend all his time reading books and studying Latin, escaping the harsh reality of his village. But today, he had to face his daily chores, and he was terrified. His 8-year-old brother, Jean, kicked his mattress and told him to get up, calling him a wet chicken and telling him it was their turn to take the family's sheep out to graze. Jacques scowled but did not say anything. The 2 boys grabbed their wooden shepherding staffs, ate a quick breakfast of hard bread, and headed out into the freezing morning air. As they walked through the village, the streets were completely empty. For months, a cloud of terror had hung over the province of Jebouan. Children and young teenagers had been disappearing from the fields and pastures, only for their mutilated, partially eaten bodies to be found days later. The attacks had started a year earlier, in the summer of 1764, when a 14-year-old girl was slaughtered while tending to her cattle. Since then, the death toll had risen into the dozens. The newspapers in Paris had run sensational stories about the killings, calling the predator the Beast of Jebouan. The king had even sent royal hunters and troops to the province to kill the creature, but despite hunting down and killing several large wolves, the gruesome attacks on children just continued. The beast was described by survivors as a monstrous creature, much larger than a normal wolf, with a long tail, a reddish coat, and a terrifying ability to walk on its hind legs. Because of this constant danger, Jacques and Jean did not take their sheep out alone. As they walked down the dirt path toward the forest, they were joined by 5 other children from neighboring farms, who brought their own sheep. Together, the group of 7 children and their combined herds moved along the edge of the dark, dense forest. Among the other children was the red-headed boy who had beaten Jacques up weeks earlier, who continued to make fun of Jacques as they walked. To pass the time and distract themselves from their fear, the children asked Jacques to tell them a story. Jacques was a wonderful storyteller, and he quickly began spinning a tale about a magical kingdom hidden beneath a deep, muddy bog at the base of a nearby hill. The children gathered around him, completely captivated by his words, even the red-headed bully. As Jacques reached the climax of his story, he suddenly heard the distinct sound of twigs snapping in the thick brush directly behind him. At the same time, a horrific, foul smell filled the air like rotting meat. Before Jacques could turn around, the red-headed boy let out a scream, dropped his staff, and began sprinting away toward the open pastures. Jacques turned his head and realized that his little brother Jean, who had been sitting right next to him, was gone. He looked up the hillside and gasped in absolute horror. There, loping up the steep incline on its hind legs, was a massive, terrifying creature. It was over 6 feet tall, covered in coarse, dark fur with a long, prehensile tail and a wide, muscular chest. In its jaws, it held 8-year-old Jean, who was screaming and bleeding as the beast carried him away. The other children panicked, screaming and running away in all directions, abandoning their sheep. Jacques' first instinct was to run as well. His legs shook, and every fiber of his being told him to flee and save his own life. But as he looked up and saw his little brother dangling from the monster's mouth, something inside Jacques changed. The boy who had been called a coward his entire life suddenly felt a wave of fierce, protective rage. Jacques yelled out to the fleeing children, commanding them to stop and stand their ground. His voice was so loud and authoritative that the children actually stopped and looked back at him in shock. Jacques raised his wooden shepherding staff and told them that they had to fight together to save Jean. Inspired by Jacques' sudden bravery, the 5 remaining children ran back to his side. Gripping their staffs, Jacques led the charge, running up the hill toward the monstrous beast. The creature turned, snarling at the approaching children, its eyes glowing with a strange, intelligent malice. It did not want to drop its prey, so it began to retreat further up the hill toward the muddy bog. This was exactly what Jacques wanted. He knew that the bog was incredibly deep, acting like quicksand for anything heavy that stepped into it. The children fanned out, surrounding the beast, and began striking it repeatedly with their wooden staffs. They poked at its eyes and hit its thick hide. The beast flailed its massive paws, trying to swipe at the children, but they stayed just out of reach, continuing to beat the creature and drive it backward. Finally, with a coordinated effort, the children pushed the beast directly into the deepest, muddiest part of the bog. The massive creature's hind legs immediately sank into the thick black mire. As it struggled to pull itself out, its heavy body sank deeper and deeper until it was trapped up to its waist. In its panic and fury, the beast dropped Jean from its jaws onto the mud. Jacques stepped forward to grab his brother, but the trapped beast let out a deafening roar and lunged forward, its long claws slashing across Jacques' stomach, tearing his coat and slicing his flesh. Jacques fell backward into the dirt, bleeding heavily. But another child quickly ran in, grabbed the semi-conscious John, and pulled him back to safety. With both brothers rescued and the beast of Jebuon trapped in the mud, the children retreated, carrying the injured Jacques and Jean back to the safety of the village. An armed group of villagers immediately went to the bog to kill the beast, but by the time they arrived, the highly intelligent creature had somehow managed to claw its way out of the mud and had escaped back into the dense forest. Both Jean and Jacques survived their horrific injuries and made a full recovery. News of the 12-year-old wet chicken who had organized a counterattack and defeated the legendary beast of Jebuon spread rapidly across France, eventually reaching the ears of King Louis X 15th. The king was so moved by Jacques' incredible bravery that he ordered the boy to be brought to the royal court in Paris. The king presented Jacques with a monetary reward and declared that the French crown would pay for his entire education at a prestigious university. Jacques Portuffi, the boy who was once mocked as a coward, went on to become a highly educated, respected young man, his name written permanently into the history books of France as the boy who stood up to the monster. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.